Let's knit a pair of cozy slippers in less than 2 hours. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make our beginner rectangle slippers, and by the end, you'll have a cozy pair of slippers that you can keep for yourself or give as a gift. Hey there, I'm Jess from Make Crew, and we've designed this pattern for you in sizes toddler through adult men, any size foot you can think of. And while I'm going to walk you through all the techniques and skills you need to make these slippers, including how to substitute and use a different stitch if you'd like, you'll also want to have the written pattern alongside you as you work, because that includes the exact stitch counts you need for each size, as well as the length to make each slipper depending on the person's foot size, and the yarn amounts, and a lot of helpful details. So all the pattern links are down below in the description box. We also have a 2-hour crochet slipper pattern. So if you prefer to crochet, definitely Google that, because it uses the same concepts to create a crochet version of these slippers. For this pattern, we're going to be using Lion Brand Woolies, which is a category 6 super bulky yarn. And you can substitute yarns if you want to. Just try to find any bulky yarn that is this thick, and you're gonna need 1 ball to make a pair of child slippers, and then depending on the size of the adult feet, you're gonna need 1 to 2 of these balls. If you want to swap out for a different yarn weight, say something a little bit thinner, you can definitely do that. What's going to be important is that you change the number of stitches in your rectangle in order to meet the measurements in the pattern. So that'll make more sense in a couple minutes, but the main idea is that you want to knit a rectangle that matches the measurements in the pattern, and then you can really make this pattern your own using any yarn and any stitch that you want. One thing that's important as you knit, regardless of the stitch you're using and the yarn you're using, is that your stitches are quite tight. We're aiming for close, tight tension on this to create the coziest slippers possible. So I'm going to be using a size 10.5 needles. That's 6.5 millimeters, and that works well with a super bulky yarn because it ensures the tension of my stitches is tight and doesn't allow a lot of air to come in. And then if you'd like to add leather soles to your slippers, which I highly recommend, I'll tell you how to get our slipper sole template at the end of this video. And I like to use thrifted leather jackets or any other sort of leather, secondhand leather I can get my hands on, but this is also a type of suede that I just purchased at Joann's. I know you can get the same thing at Michael's, any place like that, if you don't have any secondhand leather to use. To begin, I am going to use a long tail cast on, but if you have a preferred casting on method, you can definitely use that. With my long tail, we typically leave ourselves quite a bit of extra yarn here so that we can create all of our cast on stitches. But in this case, I want to leave an extra long tail because we're going to use some of what's left over for seaming later. So I'm being quite generous with my yarn tail. I would suggest starting with maybe 40 or 45 inches left over. And while you probably will not need all of that for seaming, at least then you won't have to attach another piece of yarn and weave in that end. So I have 45 or so inches over here, and then I'm just creating a slip knot, and that's going to become the very first stitch on my needles. One of the things I like to do if you tend to cast on quite tightly is to hold a second very thin needle alongside the needle you're casting on. This just creates a little extra slack so that your stitches are slightly bigger on that first cast on row, and it's easier to work into them as you get started. So I'm holding these two together. This is a size 3 needle. So you can see it's quite skinny in comparison. I don't want a lot of extra slack there, just a little bit. And to cast on, I have one of my strands over my hand like this, and I'm holding onto it, holding tension right here with my pinky and ring finger. And then I'm wrapping the other strand around my thumb like this. And to pick up my stitches, I'm going up through the thumb loop and then back and scooping up the second strand of yarn that's toward the back on my pointer finger. So now I have 2 stitches on my needles. Again, that is scooping up from here and picking up in the back. This always reminds me a little bit of Cat's Cradle, if you ever played that game as a kid. So I'm scooping from the bottom up and picking up that back yarn and pulling it through. And then I'm just pulling everything tight. Again, I don't want to pull this so tight, but this is my insurance policy against making my stitches way too tight as I'm casting on. Again, I'm just going up through that loop and grabbing the yarn in the back like that. So you are going to cast on the number of stitches that are listed in the pattern for the size that you're making. And what's cool about this pattern is you really just need to end up with a rectangle that is the suggested size. So if you want to use a thinner yarn or a thicker yarn and you're willing to experiment a little with how many stitches it takes to create that width, you can absolutely sub out yarn weights. The pattern doesn't cover how to do this in every weight of yarn. We're just talking about how to use thick yarn like Woolly's Thick and Quick. But the main idea is that you are starting with a certain number of stitches for your shoe size, and that's going to create the width of your slipper. And then we'll talk later about how to get the correct length for the foot you're making this for. That's going to be influenced by the number of rows that you work. So I'm just casting on here until I personally, for the size I'm making, need 19 stitches. So in order to count them, I'm just looking at the number of loops on my needle. So I just count them like this: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16. So I just need 3 more. 1, 2, 3. And now that I have 19 stitches on here, I can remove that thinner needle. It's done its job. And now I'm going to grab my second needle that is the size I'm going to be working with, and I can begin row 1. So in this pattern, you can use any stitch that you would like to make your rectangle. I'm going to demonstrate this in seed stitch, but if you are a very beginner knitter, I would suggest just making your rectangle with garter stitch. Garter stitch simply means you're working a knit stitch in each stitch across, then you turn it around, and then you're working a knit stitch in every stitch across, and it creates this beautiful ribbed fabric. So that is the very easiest version. If you have a more complex stitch that you like, you can work that as well. In this case, I'm going to be demonstrating using seed stitch, which is a simple pattern where we alternate knit and purl stitches, and every row is worked exactly the same. And the result is this texture that looks almost like little ridges that alternate, or I kind of think it looks like little X's. It's very pretty, and as you can see here, the tension is quite tight. This is what we're going for. We don't want a loosey-goosey slipper because that wouldn't be cozy and it wouldn't really hold up to wear. So this is intentionally tight. It's gonna feel tighter than probably a blanket that you've knit or most other projects that you would make, and that is intentional. We're going for this thick fabric. Now I still have my yarn tail here. I'm not working with that as I begin knitting. That's just gonna hang out and wait for its turn. To begin, I am going to knit my first stitch, and if you're new to knitting, you'll definitely find that the first row is the most annoying to work into. So just give yourself a little grace, get through these stitches, and it'll get easier from here. So I'm tightening my yarn tail down a little bit. I've knit this stitch. Now I'm going to purl into the next stitch. So that is just inserting my needle from the top down and then picking up a loop of yarn and pulling it up like that. So we've done a knit and a purl. Now we're gonna go back to a knit like this, and then a purl, a knit, and a purl. We're gonna alternate like this all the way across until we get to the end of the row. Your last stitch should be a knit stitch. At the end of the row, you should have something that looks about like this. So we're going to turn and work in the opposite direction. So that means, again, my needle is in my left hand. We're basically repeating exactly what we just did. It's just going to be easier now because we're not in that first row. So again, I am holding my yarn toward the back here, and I'm going to knit my first stitch. It's nice to tighten that down a little bit. The first stitch of the row has a tendency to get a little loose, so I always like to fasten it down a little bit. And now I'm going to purl in the next stitch, knit in the next stitch. So every row is starting with a knit and then going to a purl, knit, purl, all the way across, and you should be ending with a knit stitch each time. So I'm working across like this, and you may be wondering, all right, that sounds cool, but what if I get interrupted and I forget if I just did a knit or a purl? What if I can't tell what I'm supposed to do next? I'm going to show you now how to identify the stitch that you're in so that you can sort of zone out, and if you need to come bring your brain back online, this is how you do it. What I want to do is look at the next stitch and how it was worked previously to tell me if I need to do a knit or a purl. So this looks like it was a knit stitch here, and so I want to put a purl on top of it. So I'm going to purl that one. This one, because it has this bump coming out to the front right here, that means it was a purl, so I want to knit. I'm knitting the purls and purling the knits. This one, it's a little V, which means it was knit, so now I'm going to purl in that. This one has a bump coming out, so I'm going to knit that. And if that is at all confusing, another way you can check your pattern is to see what you just worked in the last stitch that you did. So you can see right here, I worked a knit stitch because you can see it's coming like a little V. It's a little harder to see here, but it's coming off the needle like a little V. Right here, you can see it's coming off the needle with a bump in the front, and the bump in the front indicates it was purl. So we know that was a purl, a knit. Now I'm going to purl the next stitch, knit, purl, knit. So if this is one of your first knitting projects ever, this is why I recommend just using garter stitch, knitting every single stitch across, because it just eliminates one of the things you have to pay attention to. If you've knit before and you're just looking for a really fast project to make or a nice gift to give, then you can experiment with the seed stitch or any other stitch that you want. What we're going to do now is continue in this pattern for several rows. Once you've worked about 8 rows, it's a good idea to pause and measure the width of your rectangle just to make sure you're within the ballpark of what's listed in the pattern, because this is going to influence how loose or tight your slipper fits. So I'm going to just measure this across. I have my stitches spread out so that they are stretched just ever so slightly, because I don't want to artificially think this is narrower than it is, but I'm also not trying to stretch it in an unnatural way. So just kind of like laying flat, and then I'm going to measure across like this. I need to be somewhere in the ballpark of 7.5 inches, so mine is measuring right on track. If you're noticing that you're way off from the measurement listed in the pattern, I would suggest, as painful as it is, tearing this out and either using a smaller or larger needle in order to get a little closer to that measurement. So if you're finding your rectangle is measuring way too big, you would want to start again with smaller needles. If you are finding yours is way too narrow, you have two choices. You can either start again with bigger needles, or you can start with more stitches across. That's an option also. We want to make sure though, as we're working, that our tension is pretty tight. So if you do decide to play with the number of stitches across in order to get the right measurement, that's fine. And that's definitely what you're going to want to do if you're using a different thickness of yarn. You just want to ensure that the tension is tight, because that's going to create the most substantial fabric that'll work well for a slipper. So once you've established that you're about on track with the width, I would say if you're off by 1/2 inch, I would not worry about that. If it's more like 1.5 inches or 2 inches, I would try again with a different needle size. But when you know you're on track, you're just going to continue now working more rows in whatever stitch you're using, and we're working until we reach a certain height. In the pattern, you'll find a recommended rectangle height for every shoe size, and you can definitely follow that, especially if you're making these as a gift for someone and you're not able to measure their foot. But if it's someone in your family and you can have them step on a piece of paper and just trace around their foot, that's a great way to determine the exact measurement you want. So if you are able to trace around their foot, you're just measuring the length of their foot from the tip of their toes back to their heel. And that'll also give you an idea of how big you want your rectangle to be. So follow the pattern if you can't measure their foot, but if you do want to measure their foot, or just kind of to double check against the pattern, you can definitely do that as well. And now we're just going to work in the same pattern until we end up with a rectangle that is the right height for the size slipper that you're making. So let's do some more rows, and we'll meet back here and talk about exactly how to measure it and then bind off so that you have a rectangle that looks like this. After you've been knitting for a while, you should have something that's looking like this. Again, if you're using a different stitch, that's totally fine. In any case, we want to measure the height of our rectangle and compare it to both the number in the pattern or the measurement that you did of the person's foot this is for. So I'm going to just take a measurement of mine. I need about an 8-inch rectangle. So this is right about there. I could possibly work another row, but I know that when I bind off, this is going to get a little bit taller. So I'm going to stop here. And what I'm doing is just checking to make sure it's the right height, because this is going to influence how long the slipper is. So if I was making this for a big-footed person, my rectangle might be closer to 9 or 10 inches, but because I'm making a child size, 8 is a great length. So now we're going to bind off, and we're going to do that in whatever stitch you have been working in. So in this case, we're going to bind off in the seed stitch, but if you've been doing garter stitch or some other stitch, you're going to continue in that pattern as you work each stitch off your needles. All that means to bind off in the pattern is to continue as you have been, just 2 stitches at a time. So I've been starting each row with a knit and then working a purl. So I'm going to do that same thing right now. And once I have 2 stitches on my needle, I'm going to insert my needle like this, lift it up and carry it over the second loop on my needle. So what I like to do in this case is use my fingernails to sort of hold this one on there, because we only want one to come off at a time. So now we have fastened off 1 stitch right here. And now we work the next stitch as we typically would. I can see that in the previous row it was a purl, which means I need to knit it now. So I'm going to knit this. Again, I have 2. And then I just repeat that same process I just did. I insert my needle like this, pick it up over the next loop, and then that next loop has now fallen off, and you can see the very beginning of a bound off edge here. So let's try that again. I just knit, so my next stitch is a purl. It can get a little harder to remember what your pattern is, the knit, purl, when you're doing it like this, because there's so many steps in between. But what you can do is look at the row below. So I can see this was a purl row because I see this bump right here. So that means I need to knit this stitch, and that's all based on this being a seed stitch pattern. So now I'm going to knit it, insert my needle like this, and pull it off. This is one of those things that gets much easier with time. So I'm using my fingernails like this because that's how I've determined is the easiest way for me to keep a grip. But just take your time with this, because it can feel kind of easy to have everything fall off your needle, and that's pretty frustrating. So do whatever you can to kind of hold it on there and just get 1 loop off at a time. So I can tell this stitch was knit, so I am going to purl, and then I'm going to lift that first loop over the next one and fasten it off. So we're going to continue like this across the entire row. You can see I'm creating an edge here, so I'm eventually going to have just a fastened off rectangle. So let's continue like this until we get to the end, and I'll show you how to fasten off the very last stitch. When I have 1 stitch left on each needle, I'm going to do just as we have been. Work that last stitch. For me, that is a knit because of that seed stitch. And now we want to do the same thing we've been doing, where we lift this first stitch over the second. So now we only have 1 loop on our needle, and now it's okay to cut your yarn off. So when I do this, I like to leave a really long tail, because we're going to possibly use your tail for seaming the few little seams we need to do to make this into a slipper. So I'm going to cut this with about 24 inches of a tail left over, and then to finish this off, all I have to do is pull the tail through so that there's no more loop left. I just have this long yarn tail. And now I have, believe it or not, the foundation of what will become my slipper. And now once you have 1 rectangle and you know exactly how many rows you need to work in order to create the right length for the foot, you can duplicate these steps, do the same thing again with the exact same number of rows, and so that you create 2 identical rectangles. And now that you've been a rectangle making machine, you should have something that looks like this. two rectangles. Regardless of the stitch you've used, they should be fairly dense like this, and we're ready to seam them into little burrito slippers. So the way I have mine positioned here with the yarn tails in the upper corners like this is important, and it's going to be how we join the toe section. So I'm envisioning this being my right slipper and my left slipper as if I just stepped into them right now. So my toes would be up here. This is the toe side, this is the heel side. And the side that your yarn tail is on is less important at your heel, because we're going to use this to join the heel section together, but it can actually be on either side of your rectangle. So what's more important, if you can identify the side that you cast on, then you can put that over here at the heel side, and then the bind off edge up here at the toe, and then each yarn tail out at the outer edge. In order to divide our rectangles up for seaming, we want to think about them in sections of 3. So you can take your stitch count across the number of stitches you cast on with and divide that by 3. And then we want to have a section that's 1/3 with a width and then 2/3 the width. So if your stitch count doesn't divide evenly by 3, like mine doesn't, I have 19 stitches here, so that isn't divisible by 3, I'm just going to put the extra stitch in my shorter section, or if you have 2 extra stitches, you can divide 1 here and 1 here. So because I have 19 stitches, I have 6 here, then I placed my stitch marker in the 7th, and then the rest of my stitches are over here. So the main point is to have 1/3 and 2/3. So this is my right slipper, and then on the left slipper, I'm doing the exact same thing. I have my stitch marker in the 7th stitch, and that is because this is going to cinch up like this. We're going to fold it over in that way, and then this is going to do the same thing, cinch up like this and fold over in this way, and so they're going to be a mirror image of each other. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to cinch in this toe using my right slipper, but the concept is the same with the left. So I've threaded my tapestry needle with this yarn tail that was in my upper outside corner here, and now we are going to whip stitch in each of these stitches, the top little V there, and then we're going to pull them tightly closed so that this sort of curves into, like I said, a little tube, the end of the burrito. So I'm going to begin by just working under both of those loops. If you've never done a whip stitch, we're just working from the same direction on each stitch. So I'm inserting my needle from the front loop to the back loop over and over again until I get to my marked stitch. Now that I'm at that marked stitch, I'm going to gently but forcefully pull on this tail because I'm trying to pull all of these stitches together. Sometimes it takes sort of yanking them and reshuffling them. We want to get this as tight as possible, but it is okay if you end up with a little gap here, because we can always close it up when we have this yarn tail over here. So now I've pulled this, it's starting to curve in, and I want to take the very corner of it here and fold it over to where my marked stitch is. So I've kind of creased that top edge like this, and now I'm going to fold over my remaining third right here across the toe. You can see now why we divided it in thirds, because we have 2/3 folded up here on the bottom, and then our top flap is the remaining third. So from here, I'm going to keep my yarn tail still on my tapestry needle. I'm going to just pop the stitch marker out so that I can see my loops a little bit better. And now we want to slip stitch this little sandwich together. So there's not a perfect way to do this. What we're aiming for is to connect this middle layer, which was our first third folded over, and then this upper layer, and we want all those 3 pieces to be kind of stacked and worked through. So we're going to use a slip stitch again, and you're just kind of working through the loops. And when you're doing this, the one thing you want to look out for is not going super deep into the toe. That's just going to shorten the overall length of your slipper. So we're just working through the top loops here, the ones that are in the very last row. And I'm just whip stitching and pulling that tight, just like that, until I get to the last stitches over here. So my top third has been joined across the row, And I want to keep this strand of yarn attached because now we're going to use it to seam up the top of the slipper a bit. So this is the part that's going to be on the top of the foot. And obviously we don't want it to stay like this because then there would be no place to actually put your foot. So you want it to open a little bit, kind of like this, because in the back we're going to seam right here. So this should have a nice diagonal slant. And when you're doing this, you want to keep an eye on just kind of, you're not lining up your rows per se, but you do want to make sure that no part of this is like scrunched up in a weird way. You kind of want this to just feel like this seam is somewhat invisible and this is just staying together magically. So I like how mine is laying like this. It's at a bit of a slant and I have my yarn still attached. So now I'm going to continue in whip stitch and I'm going to whip stitch this top edge right here into this back piece of fabric. And we want to work about halfway down our rectangle here. This is a great time if you are making these for someone that you live with or you're making them for yourself. This is a great time to try them on because you can personalize how open or not open that foot hole is. But a good rule of thumb if you're making them for someone and you want it to be a surprise is to do about halfway down your rectangle. All right, so this is how mine is looking and I'm pretty happy with that seam. If you're noticing that something looks really lumpy or kind of off, just unthread your tapestry needle and use your needle to take out some of these stitches. It's worth it to get the seam that you want when you're finishing any project because it just has such a big influence on how the whole thing looks and then therefore how you feel about it. So if you're not happy with it, just try again. But if you are, then you can weave in your yarn tail because we're done with this one. Whenever I'm making something like this that I know is going to get a lot of wear and that is probably maybe going to get washed, then I know it's extra important to really secure my yarn tails. So what I'm doing is just working back and forth, picking up some loops as I go and really trying to get some friction on this tail. I've gone back and forth about 4 times now, and that's really securing it in there so that then it doesn't unravel. And then we'll just trim that off. So now we have half of our burrito seamed up, and the second part to do is even easier. We're just going to seam up the back of this rectangle, and in order to do that, we just want it folded in half. So we're gonna work stitch for stitch back and forth in a little zigzag stitch using the yarn tail that's already attached. So regardless of which side it's on, you can thread your tapestry needle with this yarn tail, and I'll show you how to work this seam. With my tapestry needle, I'm going to work through the stitch on the opposite side, and then a zigzag stitch like this is exactly how it sounds. It's almost like we're lacing shoes or something. We're gonna work back and forth, stitch for stitch, across the back of the slipper. And what's most important here is that we are pulling it snug enough that it doesn't have any gaps in the back, and that we are working stitch for stitch, keeping them lined up, because that's gonna create the most invisible looking seam. So we're just gonna work down until we get to the bottom of this heel, and then once again, you can weave in your yarn tail and cut it off because we're all done seaming. Oh, how cute! Isn't that adorable? It's like a little origami slipper. We have so many more projects coming out in the next few months that are simple and fast, just like this. So if you're enjoying this tutorial, please consider subscribing because I don't want you to miss those fun patterns. You are now going to repeat those seaming steps on the other rectangle. So because in this case, my left slipper is going to start its burrito from here, I would cinch up this part of the toe just like we did on the right foot, and then fold this over just as before, sew up, make sure we keep it about the same length of seam. So you can see then their mirror image. This one is slanting that way toward the pinky toe. This one is slanting this way toward the right pinky toe. And then when you're done with that, then seam up the heel, and we'll come back here and talk about the finishing touches you can consider. Once your slippers are complete, you may want to add leather soles to the bottom, which makes them extra durable. They'll last longer, and then they're less slippery on the floor. So I've got a video that shows you exactly how to add these soles along with a free template that you can print to cut out your own, and you can check out that video right here.